Coming in at number 10, we have Winter's Embrace. This skill line is a great example of what I'd like to see others have. With a good mix of offensive and defensive power, it can be used on multiple different roles. It still needs a little love to compete with some of the others for DPS, but it's definitely one of the better lines overall, and I think it's the right direction for subclassing. Winter's Revenge and Arctic Blast will be the two staple skills for DPS to run from this line. On their own, they aren't anything too special, however, they have a greatly increased chance to apply the chilled status effect, and then that is buffed even further by the Glacial Presence passive. This passive also increases the damage of applying chilled, making the combo of using these skills and other high status chance frost damage, such as a frost glyph, really strong when using this skill line. You also get another 15% increase to frost damage with the Piercing Cold passive, playing into this theme even more. The ultimate seems pretty good now as well, as it stacks up to 18% damage done, and that portion lasts for 12 seconds after the frost part of the ultimate ends. I would like to see the frost effect last the full 20 seconds too, even if it's toned down a tiny bit to compensate, but I do like this ult a bit better than I did in the past. Overall for DPS, I'll give this skill line a B. I'm definitely going to be working on a frosty setup at some point with the new update, and even just using this line in a more traditional type of DPS setup, you can get some pretty good results. If you want to see more with this, make sure to join the Discord server. I'll have it linked below. Lots of talented players in there, and some have already shared setups using this skill line. Coming in at number 9, we have Daedric Summoning. The Sorcerer skill line has some pretty good tools, especially if you want to do a pet build. The Volatile Familiar, Twilight Tormentor, and Charged Atronach are all really strong if you're getting that 50% extra damage from Daedric Prey. Sadly, this boost does not work for other classes' pets. That would have been a really cool new interaction unlocked with subclassing, and since you get so many good skills when subclassing, when I threw a bunch of pets together, including the Warden's Bear Ultimate, which left me unable to use the Storm Atronach, I actually got worse results using Daedric Prey than just slotting another DPS ability from one of those lines, and that kind of sucks. So I hope they'll revisit that interaction there or figure out another way to make the Zoo combo a bit more interesting. Bound Aegis and Bound Armaments are both really good morphs in this skill line as well. You can slot on either bar and get a bonus 8% to your Magicka or Stamina. Combined with the Expert Summoner passive, this is 13% more of your max resource that you're stacking into. The combo of these is certainly not the best damage boost passive in subclassing, but it's not bad either. Power Stone and Daedric Protection are also very nice passives here for cheaper ultimates and 5% less damage taken. And the Daedric Protection will work without pets active as long as you have Bound Aegis or Armaments slotted on one of your bars. Haunting Curse is a pretty awesome skill too, but sadly this is the non-pet focused morph, and the skill line falls off a decent bit if you're not using the pets. It's rough because I really like Bound Armaments and Haunting Curse, but can't really justify taking this skill line just for those unless I'm also running the pets. So for pet setups, I'll give this skill line a solid B, but that falls to a C if you're not using pets. At number 8, we have Animal Companions. The Bear Ultimate Wild Guardian is still a really strong option. It does require being double barred, but it does excellent single target damage. The spammable Dive and its morphs are okay, but generally outclassed with all the possible combos you can get now with subclassing. However, Subterranean Assault and Deep Fissure are both excellent morphs here for Scorch. Sub-Assault is generally a little better for damage if you don't need the Major or Minor Breach from Deep Fissure, but both can work well even without that consideration depending on what fits your sustain needs better. The Swarm skill has been left behind the last few years and is in desperate need for some more love. Both the Blue Betty and Bullnetch morphs are great. They not only give your major sorcery and brutality buffs, but they also give you 5% damage done increase and help with sustain. You can just pick the one that helps the resource you are having more trouble sustaining. For the passives, Savage Beast is pretty nice for the extra ult gen. Flourish is really good for sustain, giving an extra 20% to Magicka and Stamina recovery. And Advanced Species is good too, giving extra crit damage per Animal Companion's ability slotted. In most setups, you'll generally be looking at 5 to 10% from this, but you could rearrange skills to get this higher if you are needing more for your build. Overall, this is a pretty solid skill line. I have it in a tier above the last two in the low A tier. The Shulks and Bear definitely help keep it relevant. Without those, the rest of it isn't super appealing. Would definitely like to see some more love into those other abilities here like Dive and Swarm. Next up at number 7, we have Ardent Flame. This Dragonite skill line has several good reasons you might want to choose it. The ultimate Standard of Might is one of the best in the game. It's a bit expensive, but does great AoE damage and gives you 15% increased damage and reduced damage taken. Pretty much a better version of Northern Storm for PvE at least. Molten Whip is one of the better spammables in the game. Not only does it hit hard, but it has the Seething Fury stacks you can build up for extra weapon and spell damage. Searing Strike and Fiery Breath, and both of those morphs are really solid long dots that you can use. And then Flames of Oblivion is just one of the best skills in the game overall. It does really good damage and passively gives you your Major Prophecy and Savagery on both of your bars. The passives are decent. Combustion adds a lot to your burning and poisoned status damage and also helps with sustain. Warmth is an okay buff, now offering 6% to your dot abilities. It does require dealing direct damage with a skill in this line every 3 seconds to trigger it though. So aside from using Whip, you really aren't going to get 100% uptime on this one, so it doesn't work as well in AoE scenarios. So I'd like to see this passive improved a little bit more. Searing Heat is a bit boring, to be honest. I'd love to see these types of passives, we'll talk about this more later too, but the ones that just add additional time onto your skills, just do away with these and just put the extra time onto the base skills. Then that opens up the possibility of some new creative options here. Another possible route would be to have it extend skills outside of this skill line too, so maybe all flame and poison abilities are increased by 4 seconds. And this could be the type of passive that would make subclassing open up some really interesting interactions. Then we have World and Ruin. This one is solid, but honestly could see it being 10% to flame and poison and not being overpowered. Overall, I'll give Ardent Flame an A. Very good skills, but I couldn't get it higher on the list due to the passives being a tad bit underwhelming. I will throw in a caveat and say I think it might be one of the best few to choose from for certain encounters that are a bit shorter and your ultimate is active for the full duration of those fights. I think in those scenarios, this might jump up in the top 3 or 4. All right, for these next two, I had trouble choosing between them, so I'll just put them as a tie at number 5. And these are the two Templar lines, Dawn's Wrath and Aedric Spear. I'll go through them both and explain why I think they're so close. Starting with Aedric Spear, this one kind of has the opposite issue of Ardent Flame. The passives are really great, but it doesn't really have skills that are super appealing. Aside from jabs, of course, both morphs are awesome here, and as of update 46, they deal their full damage in an AoE, making them the second strongest AoE spammable in the game behind Fate Carver. There is unfortunately now an AoE cap of 6 on how many you can hit at once. Sadly, none of the other skills in this line are typically worth running on a DPS. With subclassing here and so many options to choose from, they just get pushed out by the other combos you can put in. Spear Shards got a little buff where with Luminous Shards you can now take your own synergy, so that can be nice for solo play or in a group with no orbs or shards going. And then Blazing Spear had its dot buffed quite a bit, but sadly it's still not a very good dot. I had high hopes when I first saw the change in the patch notes, but after testing it's generally not good enough to fit onto your bar, and that can cause an issue with our first passive here, Piercing Spear. This gives 12% crit damage, but you have to have an ability slotted for it to be active. If you're doing a jabs build, this is no problem, but for Fate Carver or other spammable builds, it's hard to make room for what would essentially be a dead skill to take advantage of this. Spear Wall gives minor protection and minor berserk. Again, only really going to keep this up if you are using jabs as your spammable. However, even if you can't take advantage of these two passives, the other two are really good, and the reason you'll see a lot of people grabbing this line, even if not using any skills from it. Balanced Warrior gives 6% more weapon and spell damage, along with 6% more armor. This is especially good in organized group play where you have more sources of these stats. So the higher your base weapon and spell damage and armor are, the more beneficial Balanced Warrior is. Really strong passive here. Then we have Burning Light. This triggers off any damage done, can happen once every half second, and it takes 4 stacks to go off. So essentially every 2 seconds you just get a free tick of damage, and it does quite a bit. Fractal got a 166k parse and has a YouTube video up for it already, and this is after all of the PTS nerfs, so this is likely the balance that we are going live with. And I'll have Fractal's video linked down below if you want to check it out. You can see Burning Light was one of the top damage contributors here. However, it is really important to note that Burning Light does not trigger in AoE. So while it looks very good for single target damage, it does not translate well to AoE heavy encounters. So while it is really solid, I don't think Aedric Spear is necessarily the clear-cut winner for Fate Carver builds like some in the community have suspected. So that leads us to the other Templar line, Dawn's Wrath. This one kind of goes the other way again, where it has some really great skills, but the passives are very underwhelming for damage. I say great skills, but then we get to Nova. This one is severely dated as an ultimate. Major Maim has a lot of sources nowadays, so having it tied to a high-cost ultimate is just a really inefficient way to provide it. I'd love to see this debuff completely removed from this skill, and the Solar Prison morph given more offensive power or a unique offensive debuff. and the Solar Disturbance morph given some kind of unique defensive power or defensive debuff. When you account for the synergy, it isn't too far off from being decent for damage, it just needs a little bit more love to catch up to the other DPS ultimates. Vampire's Bane is an okay skill if you need the Prophecy and Savagery, but I don't see this one being as commonly used now due to more limited bar space with all the good subclassing skills. Solar Barrage is pretty great though. The dot from it isn't anything too special, but it gives you a 22-second buff that increases all of your class ability damage by 5%. So this does work for any other class ability as well. Power of the Light is a really strong single target ability, definitely worth slotting on most builds using this line, but will probably be hard to squeeze into a Fate Carver setup. And then Radiant Destruction was changed quite a bit for Update 46. Both morphs now last 3.8 seconds instead of 1.8 seconds, and they both scale up to 500% increased damage now, and they both had their base damage increased by about 16%. However, instead of starting at 50% health remaining, Radiant Oppression now starts at 40%, and Radiant Glory starts at 33%. So that pushes back that scaling a bit later than what we're normally used to. The ideal time to start beaming will generally be around 30 to 35% for Radiant Oppression, and probably about 25 to 30% for Radiant Glory. Of course, this can vary based on which spammable you're using. When we compare the old versions to the new ones, Oppression starts dealing more damage than its predecessor at about 22% health remaining, and then it pulls away, ending up about 16% ahead of the old version. Then Glory passes up its former self at about 16 to 17% health remaining, and then pulls away, ending up about 19% ahead of its old version. So in relation to each other, they're kind of the opposite of where they were before. In the old way, they started out about even, and then Oppression slowly pulled ahead of Glory. Now Oppression takes off first, but then they slowly meet up at the end. I know a lot of people aren't a big fan of the longer cast time of 3.8 seconds now, and I can definitely understand that. I think it's going to take a lot of getting used to, but I actually like the scaling much better now in this version than the previous. The execute section of a fight is generally when things get the hardest, especially on hard mode encounters, so having that damage ramp up higher there is going to be really beneficial to burn that phase more quickly. It's also the reason I think that it is a competitive option for Fate Carver builds, even though dummy parses show it slightly lower. For example, King 8 got 164k here with a pretty similar build to Fractal, except using Dawn's Wrath instead of Aedric Spear. And while it is slightly behind, the execute portion of the fight is actually going to be much faster, and I think for some groups that part being prioritized makes a bit more sense than just worrying about the total damage per second from start to finish, given how close the two setups are overall. So the passives here in Dawn's Wrath are really kind of the weak spot. Nothing really here for damage in group play, but maybe that's fairly balanced considering how strong the abilities are. Like we talked about earlier, I'd still love to see passives like this one here get scrapped and some more interesting ones put in their place. These time extension ones just kind of seem like filler passives. Prism is pretty decent. It gives you some ultimate generation. Illuminate is good if you are solo or in a group that doesn't have Earthen Heart from the DK skill line going for the Brutality version of it. And then Restoring Spirit is nice for reduced cost abilities, including your ultimates. Overall, a very solid skill line. I can see this one being really popular for content with nasty execute phases. So yeah, Aedric Spear and Dawn's Wrath, both in the A tier, tied at number 5. For 3 and 4, I kind of feel like I have a tie again, so I'll just say tied at 3, we have Stormcalling and Gravelord. Though to be honest, these two and the two Templar lines we just went over are kind of all lumped together in this section here. I can see many reasons to take these over each of the others for various situations, and even DK's Ardent Flame kind of jumps up in this same group as well. So let's start with Stormcalling. Overload is a really great ultimate for opening burst in a fight. It used to be considered a bit cheesy since if you were on a sorcerer, you were likely using your Atronach ultimate for your group, but now you might not even be using that skill line. The heavy attack version of this is also really good on heavy attack builds. You can get some absolutely nutty damage if you just toggle your ultimate on while the target is off balance. One thing to keep in mind though, you can't generate ultimate while this thing is toggled on, so plan accordingly around that. Mage's Fury is a pretty sad execute for PvE. I'd love to see this one get a buff. Maybe it could be a regular spammable that turns into an execute on one of the morphs, or maybe bonus damage to monsters so that it isn't overtuned for PvP. Lightning Form is a great skill. Hurricane is usually the preferred morph here, but Boundless Storm is good too. Both give you your major armor buffs, and Hurricane gives you minor expedition while it's up, while Boundless gives you major expedition for 4 seconds when you cast it. Lightning Splash is pretty good too. Lightning Flood will generally be the preferred morph for group play since you cast every 10 seconds instead of 15 seconds, and so you'll give more synergy opportunities for your teammates. They also just added in that you can take your own synergy with this, making it much better for solo or small groups. Pretty strong ability when you factor in that synergy damage. Crit Surge is also a classic. This is great for pug groups where you might not reliably get good healing or major sorcery and brutality. And then we have Streak, not really relevant for PvE combat, but it can be used for mobility to cut down on time for speedruns, so it's a bit more niche, but definitely a nice tool to have. So the skills here are decent, nothing too crazy, but the passives are pretty nice. Capacitor here increases all 3 recoveries, so pretty good boost to your sustain. Energized is 5% to both physical and shock damage. I'd actually like to see Hurricane swapped to shock damage, and then you could just drop this physical off altogether and give like 15% shock damage on this passive to match the 15% frost on Winter's Embrace. And then some other line that is more physical focused could get like 5 to 10% physical damage, maybe in the two-handed line or Fighter's Guild line, or maybe even reserved for a future line. Then Amplitude is their reverse execute passive, so you start the fight with 10% increased damage, and then that goes down to 1% as the enemy's health decreases. And then Expert Mage gives weapon and spell damage for each sorcerer ability slotted. Unfortunately, most skills in this line are better suited as backbar abilities, so unless you're pairing this with Daedric Summoning, you don't really get a lot out of this passive. It would be cool if this bonus worked on both bars to help it stand out a little bit. I do think overall this line needs some work, but that doesn't mean it isn't strong. As I mentioned, I had a hard time ranking this with Gravelord. I think this and the previous 2 Templar lines are better options for using with a Fate Carver beam build than Gravelord is, but for non-beam builds, Gravelord is pretty hard to pass up. And I think it's still decent with beam builds too, just not as crazy as it was early in the PTS. But Gravelord has some really good active and passive abilities here. Colossus is an awesome ultimate to have, giving major vulnerability. If this buff isn't being kept up by support, definitely worth casting this for the increased damage. Flame Skull and its morphs are decent spammables. Both morphs are pretty good if you're using the Gravelord's Sacrifice skill, as every 3rd cast pops in a 6-meter AoE, and the skill itself also deals 15% more damage. But even with regular Blighted Blastbones setups, Venom Skull is pretty solid, as other Necro skill casts count towards stacking up to its 3rd cast. So speaking of Blastbones, the Blighted morph is one of the top skills in the game, really great damage, and thanks to the reusable parts passive, it is insanely cheap to cast. And since you cast it every 3rd skill, it can really help balance sustain on just about any build. Using it with Storm Cursed in an AoE heavy build, I was able to sustain all the way through a 21 million dummy parse using an AoE spammable. That's way more time than you typically need for an AoE setup, but pretty crazy that it enables that. I did go over the setup in my last video. If you want to check that out, I'll have it linked below. For the other morph, Gravelord's Sacrifice, this is typically not quite as appealing as Blighted, but still a very solid skill. It increases all your Necromancer abilities damage by 15%, and also increases your other dot ability damage by 15% too. This can make for some pretty fun setups and a bit easier rotation since you can just cast it every 20 seconds instead of every 3. One thing to keep in mind is that you do need to recast it when you have about 3 or 4 seconds left on the timer to account for the delay in him leaping to you. You can pair this with another 20-second skill if that makes it easier on you. Originally, this was going to be boosting Fate Carver and Jesus Beam, but those skills were changed over to direct damage, and that interaction no longer works. Next up, we have Boneyard. This is definitely worth running if no one has it going in the group. The AoE Breach and Minor Vuln are great debuffs to have going. But for many subclassing option setups with so many good skills to choose from now, I do see this getting dropped sometimes. But for more standard Necro type setups, especially when using Corpse Burster, you're probably going to want to keep this skill going. Skeletal Mage is in a similar boat. It's a very solid skill, but in subclass setups, it doesn't always make the cut. I wish the Arcanist did a little better for AoE damage. The Archer is nice single target damage, but the Arcanist morph is a bit underwhelming. And then Siphon's one of the best skills in the game. Mystic gives you some sustain and is great for proccing Storm Cursed if you're using that setup. However, Detonating is generally the go-to as it has nice explosion damage when it ends or when you refresh it early, making it a great semi-spammable and a way to trigger the Corpse Burster class set. You do have to be a Necromancer base to use this set, just keep that in mind. Oh yeah, and just slotting this skill gives you an extra 3% additional damage. Really stacked skill overall. So as you can see, Necro has some great damage abilities here, but the passives might be even better. Death Knell increases your crit chance by 20% to targets under 33% health. So this averages out over the course of a fight to 6.6% effective crit chance. However, damage is typically higher in Execute, and Execute is typically the harder section in an encounter. So it's actually worth a bit more than the average might indicate. Really great passive for melting enemies at the end. Dismember is really good too, giving you over 3k penetration. This is pretty appealing for all types of gameplay. And then Rapid Rot increases your dot damage by 10%, so 4% more than DK's Warmth passive gets, and it doesn't require anything to maintain it. Really great passive here. Overall, Gravelord is definitely one of the top DPS skill lines to choose from, and I think will be very popular for a lot of setups. This one lands in the high A tier. And then finally, for the last two on this list, we have our S tier skill lines. I think these two will be present in most builds that are optimizing for DPS. At number 2, we have Herald of the Tome. The Unblinking Eye ultimate is a great one to run, ever so slightly less burst than a Destro ult, but it costs 175 instead of 250. So over the course of a fight, you can get more of these off. I like both morphs here. Languid is slightly more damage, but Tide Kings is a bit underrated, I think. It gets more ticks overall, so it actually ends up doing nearly the same damage, and it will follow your target as well. This morph is a little bit less bursty with the longer duration though. Rune Blades is a decent spammable. I do think it could use some work to better differentiate the morphs. I remember in the original Arcanist playtest in 2023, I suggested that the AoE morph should lower the damage on the first 2 hits, then have the third hit equal to that of a regular AoE spammable. I think this would create a much better use case for each of these. If you are using Tentacular Dread, it is a decent skill to generate Crux though, since that morph of the flail consumes Crux. Next up, we have Fate Carver. I probably don't need to say much about this. I think we all know how good it is. Sadly, it does have a 6 target cap now as of update 46, so any targets hit beyond that won't receive damage from it. Templar's Jab's got the same treatment, and I have to say I'm not a big fan of that design. But yeah, both morphs are really good here. Exhausting is a tiny bit more damage, and Pragmatic gives you a nice shield and is cheaper. If you are using a 2-handed back bar, which is pretty popular now for beam builds going into this update, Pragmatic is definitely easier to sustain. Unless you go Magicka Arcanist, then you can sustain 2-handed back bar and Exhausting Fate Carver pretty easily. If you aren't going to be using Coral Riptide and you do want to use a 2-handed back bar, really no reason not to go with the Magicka Arcanist now, so I think we might see an increase in the amount of those getting played, though Stam should still be very popular too. Next, we have Abyssal Impact. Cephaliarch is still the preferred option for beam builds. However, if you're going to do a non-beam build, this skill line is actually still really nice to take for this Tentacular Dread morph. Casting this with 3 stacks does a lot of damage and puts an 11% damage taken debuff on your enemy instead of that 5% that the other morph gets. Even if you only cast it with 1 Crux, that's still 7% more damage on the target. Pretty crazy strong for the rest of your abilities with subclassing going. I've seen this used in a ton of non-beam setups. And then we have Tome Bearer. Both morphs here are really good too. Both give you Crux from a class skill dealing damage if you have no Crux. Both give you Major Sorcery and Brutality passively just for slotting. But Inspired Scholarship is a bit more damage since it ticks every 3 seconds instead of every 5 seconds. However, Recuperative can be really nice to help sustain with builds that are cutting it close. And then finally, we have Fulminating Rune. This one is often outclassed now for your personal DPS with all of the subclassing options available. However, you do give your teammates 3 damage synergies to take per cast. So I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's possible that there still should be 3 to 4 people using this in your group to get everyone their synergy damage. For the passives, we have Fated Fortune. This one actually requires generating or spending Crux to trigger the passive. It doesn't count if you're at 3 Crux and use a skill that generates it. You have to go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, or spend it. So this was another one I gave early feedback on in 2023 about how it really limited the ways that you can play the Arcanist. In a typical beam build, it's not an issue, but if you want to play a different kind of style, this passive becomes very limiting. Next, we get some weapon and spell damage when we are restored Magicka or Stamina. This doesn't work with passive recovery, but other types of restores should all work. Then next is Psychic Lesion. This is nice for more status effect chance and damage. Can add in a decent little bit there. And then finally, Splintered Secrets for some more penetration. Typically we'd have 2 abilities triggering this on a single bar, but sometimes 3, so it could be a very nice amount of extra penetration. Overall, Herald of the Tome has really strong active and passive abilities. It's going to be hard to pass up for subclassing in Update 46. And then finally, at number 1, we have the Assassination skill line. I really can't get this one out of any of my setups. It's definitely S tier. Whether I'm going for a frost theme or a lightning theme, whether I'm going with beams or memes, this seems to add more damage than any other option. So let's break down why. I'll switch things up here and cover the passives first. Master Assassin gives a 6% more crit chance when flanking. This is pretty big for most content. Executioner, when an enemy dies within 2 seconds of being damaged by you, you restore 1000 magicka and stamina. So this will be a bit of a dead passive in single target fights, but is really strong for AoE. Pressure Points gives us 2.5% crit chance for each assassination ability slotted, so we'll typically always have at least 1, but sometimes 2 or 3, making this plus Master Assassin a crazy amount of extra crit chance. And then finally we have Hemorrhage. This gives 10% crit damage if you have an ability from the skill line slotted, as well as Minor Savagery for you and your group for 20 seconds when you crit. Very easy 100% uptime on that. So as you can see, already really stacked with the passives with all the extra crit chance and crit damage, but the actives are very good too. For the ultimate, both morphs are great. Incap gives you a bit of extra time on the 20% damage taken debuff if you cast at over 120 ultimate. And Soul Harvest gives you 10 ultimate each time you kill an enemy. For 12-person content, this won't proc super reliably, but if there are enough adds, you should still get a little bit extra out of it. For solo and 4-man though, this will be triggering all the time and will be huge for generating more ultimate. Either way, for both single target and AoE, you'll want to have this slotted on your front bar to unlock your Nightblade passives. For our main spammable, we have Surprise Attack and Concealed Weapon. Both are pretty good depending on if you have a Stamina or Magicka build. Surprise Attack has a guaranteed chance to trigger Sundered, which adds in quite a bit of extra damage, plus a guaranteed crit once every 3 seconds. And then Concealed Weapon has a higher base damage to it and gives you Minor Expedition passively for slotting, increasing your movement speed by 15% on both of your bars. These won't be used in Fate Carver setups, but could be nice single target spammables to use depending on the combination of your other 2 skill lines you go with. Lotus Fan is a pretty good 5-second damage over time ability. It is a gap closer, so it can be a bit clunky to use when standing still in front of an enemy. It's not as fluid as Stampede for that type of scenario, but the damage is solid, especially for AoE. Don't think I would use this with the Fate Carver build though. Killer's Blade and Impale are both very nice execute abilities, not quite as strong as Jesus Beam, but since you'll pretty much always be using this line and the Dawn's Wrath line isn't quite as stacked, these are good backup options to go with for non-Jesus Beam builds. Then Grim Focus is another big reason why this line is so good to take. Both morphs are good. If you use this skill actively, Merciless Resolve hits a little bit harder. However, Relentless Focus stacks up to 400 weapon and spell damage instead of 300, so it's a great option to just slot on the back bar and have a ton of extra passive damage. This skill will be slotted on most all PvE DPS builds, some using it actively, some passively. For Fate Carver builds, you'll just have it on the back bar for a passive boost. It's also nice there on the back bar because it keeps your Assassination passive active on both bars, since Incap or Soul Harvest will typically be on the front bar. So overall, Assassination is definitely my top pick for DPS subclassing lines, top of the S tier. This is going to be in pretty much every build I make for Update 46. And there we have it, the top 10 DPS lines for subclassing. I did a full tier list over on my live stream on Twitch. It was really fun hanging out with the community and collectively working on it, so make sure to stop by over there sometime. But let me know what you think about the upcoming subclassing update. Are you excited for the changes? Personally, I think it's pretty cool, but it needs a lot of work to get some of these other skill lines at a playable level for a better variety of roles. I'm hoping they stick with it over the coming months and even things out a bit. I'd love to one day have a reason to play so many of these skill lines that are getting left behind for Update 46. Thank you so much for watching. A big shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Really appreciate the support. If you'd like to help out the channel, there are links down below. And a special thanks to these folks here. I couldn't keep doing this without you. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.